Hello, and welcome to the 47-day Ketogenic Diet Challenge Kickoff webinar. Thank you very much for attending and registering, all that good stuff. I am Jason Yun. I will be taking you through the webinar as we make the transition from carbohydrates to fat. I'll be going over everything that you need to know about ketogenic, low carb, high fat, and everything that you'll need to know about the 47-day ketogenic challenge. So I'll probably be making this into two separate videos. 30 minutes will be the maximum length, and let's get right into it. So first, what is keto? All right, so there's plenty of nicknames for keto. So you have the ketogenic diet, or the keto diet, which is the main things that it's called. Low carb, high fat. LCHF is the acronym for that. Primal keto, nutritional ketosis, fat burning diet, carb night, and the list goes on and on and on. Okay, but the main thing is that it revolves around fat. Okay? So sugar to fat burner. This is the primary reason that you want to switch to a more ketogenic type diet. You cannot burn fat when carbs are present. Okay? And when I say carbs from now on through the rest of this presentation, just know when I say carbs, I'm not talking about vegetables or highly fibrous things like nuts and seeds and other carbohydrate things. I'm talking about processed carbohydrates. Okay? So what carbs do, they spike your blood sugar, and from that blood sugar, insulin is released from the pancreas. And the insulin is trying to return that blood sugar back down to normal, so back down to homeostasis. And in return, when insulin is present, it's stuffing fatty acids back into the fat cells and making the fat cells bigger and fatter, and hence making the person bigger and fatter as well. With keto, you basically are controlling your blood sugars, which controls your insulin, which controls your fat stores. So fat doesn't get pushed into the fat stores. You use fat as fuel, and it also controls your hunger. Okay. Then we want to deplete the glycogen levels. Glycogen is our stored carbohydrate. Once we complete or deplete the stored carbohydrate, that's when all the magic of ketosis happens. We start to use fuel as fat, or fat as fuel, and we start using our own body fat as fuel. So what is a ketone? A ketone is an energy byproduct when the body converts from sugar to fat burner. So glucose, which is the broken down form of carbohydrate, so when you digest carbohydrate, it gets turned into glucose. It provides the body 38 ATP molecules, or 38 ATP per glucose molecule. And in comparison, a fatty acid, which is the broken down form of fat, gives you 146 ATP. So ATP is basically your energy powerhouse. So when you're working out, when you're walking, when you're doing things in the yard, any type of physical activity, that's what ATP is. So basically, fatty acids will give you 4 times more than a carbohydrate will, or fat will give you 4 times more than a carb will. So pretty impressive. And we'll talk about exercise here and later on in the webinar here. But before we get into that, what is ketoacidosis? Okay. Ketoacidosis routinely messed up with ketosis. So it is a serious life-threatening condition that occurs mostly in type 1 diabetes and occasionally in type 2. It is a loss of the beta cell functioning in which your body simultaneously will have high blood sugar levels and also high ketone levels. Okay? Again, it's often confused with ketosis. And this was actually the reason I didn't do ketosis or the ketogenic diet, and I badmouthed it for years. So that was the closed-minded me. Now I'm much more open and happy that I am, because I'm doing the ketogenic diet, and hopefully you will be too. So Don't confuse ketoacidosis with ketosis. I know they sound kind of the same, but ketoacidosis really will just be towards type 1 diabetics and type 2, some type 2. All right, what is keto adapted? So being keto adapted, what happens during adaptation and how long will it take? So being keto adapted means you are using ketones or fat as your primary fuel source. So meaning your glycogen levels and your glucose levels are low and you're using ketones as energy. But the thing is, you have to eat. Okay? So you have to consume enough fat and enough calories for your body to make the transition. Calories are fuel to your body. Right? On this diet, you don't have to count calories, and this is not a starvation diet. Okay? So you should not be getting hungry in between meals. Okay? How long will it take? I don't know. It's going to be different for everybody in this regard. How is your nutrition going in? What was your past nutrition like? Some people it'll take as little as 6 weeks, or some people it'll take as little as 1 week, and others it'll take up to 6 weeks. But that's why we've created the challenge to help you get into ketosis as soon as possible. So hopefully those 6 weeks will be eliminated, because usually if it takes somebody 6 weeks to get in, they are making a lot of mistakes, which we are going to help you avoid. Because the benefit is when you get keto adapted, that's when all the magic happens. And that is the goal. The number one goal is to get you there as soon as possible. So, how to keto adapt? All right, first and foremost, this is not a low-carb diet. Okay? If you've done low-carb diets and it didn't work for you, then I guarantee you were not in ketosis. And you were probably eating low fat as well, and probably too many grams of protein, too much protein. So number one, macros. We need to adjust our macros. And what is a macro? It's short for macronutrient. So first is carbs. Carbs is the macronutrient, and it's the most important to lower. Because remember, eat carbs, that will release blood sugar, which will release insulin, which will store and pack on body fat. You can't run off ketones and glucose at the same time. Your body will pick glucose every time, but that's our fault. It's not our body's fault. So we've never been so exposed to carbs at every corner, and it's not the way it should be. Next macronutrient is protein. The ketogenic diet is not a high protein diet. It is a moderate protein diet. So you have to understand that. I eat anywhere between 60 and 90 grams of protein per day. That's it. 60 to 90 grams. My body weight's typically between 172 and 180. You don't need as much protein as experts have told you to believe, as like I used to recommend. So I used to recommend at least a gram of protein per pound of body weight. So you don't need that much. Plus, fat is protein sparing. So the more fat you eat, the less protein you'll need as well. And you can't eat too much protein on a ketogenic diet. It's gluconeogenesis, which I'll go into once we get to the protein section of the talk. And finally, the last macronutrient is fat. Okay, you need to, if you're eating a standard American diet, high carb, low fat, you need to start thinking about fat, how you do carbs now, and then reverse it. Okay? Fat is yummy and tasty, and it does not increase your blood sugar. So it will not cause an insulin spike, which will not cause body fat to be stored. You'll be burning body fat instead. You've been lied to about fat for over 50 years, and your total calories from fat will range from anywhere from 50 to 90%. We'll talk about fat a lot more when we get into that. The ratios depend person to person. I'm usually around 80 to 85% fat, 10 to 15% protein, and then the rest from carbs. Some people can handle more carbs, some people can handle more protein. So that's a starting point that we need to figure out to help get you into ketosis as soon as possible so you can start getting those benefits. All right, keto flu and other signs and symptoms that you are doing it wrong. So before we get into what to do, we're going to talk about what not to do. So consuming too much protein. So we just went over some of that. Too much protein will take you out of ketosis, which is why, again, this is not a high protein diet. I did a ketogenic gluten-free challenge, I think in 2013, and I did it wrong. It was much, much too high in protein. I was probably eating 3 to 4 times more protein than I am now. And so I guarantee I was not in the ketogenic state because I was still eating 6 meals a day. I was hungry every 2 to 4 hours. So chicken breast is not ketogenic. Egg whites are not ketogenic. You want to focus more on the fatter cuts. Next up, not eating enough fat. This might be the hardest for most people, even more than the carbs and the protein. If you still have that fear of fat and you're still listening to the fear mongers of fat is bad for you, fat will cause heart disease, all that stuff, then you just need to get over it. So Big Food and the USDA and the other big companies, American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, they basically convinced us that fat is bad and that we should not be eating it. And they're still lying to us about it today. Okay. Saturated fat is the most important fat. I have an entire slide on saturated fat because it's so important that you need to understand that and you need to get that. Saturated fat should make up the bulk of your fat consumption. Next up is eating too often. All right, like I said, I used to preach the 6 meals a day, smaller meals throughout the day, so you basically keep steady blood sugar. Problem is, if you're eating carbs, that blood sugar is going to stay high, that insulin is going to stay high, you're going to be storing fat basically all day long. Okay? I personally used to eat 6 to 10 meals a day. All right, and if you're eating carbs, you will have to do that because once that blood sugar drops down, you start getting those hunger pains, and you either eat or you feel like crap. Okay? The longer you can go without, the longer you can go in between meals, the more ketones you will build up, the more body fat you will burn off as fuel. So, next up is too many carbs. General rule on ketogenic is 50 or under. This will vary from person to person. I typically do around 30 net carbs per day. Net carbs I'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, 50 is the general rule. Some people will be a lot lower. Some people can handle a little bit more than 50. Not enough calories. So this is huge. Calories are energy, and especially fat calories. If you don't eat enough calories, you don't eat enough fat calories, you're not going to get in ketosis, you're not going to get the benefit. Okay? And too little calories, your body will start to go into starvation mode. So I've got a huge, biggest starvation study in the history. I'm going to talk about more about that, and it's very, very interesting. Then we have too much stress. Okay? Stress, if it's not controlled, it's going to control you. Okay? Your hormones, your emotions, and your body and your health. Okay? This is a big reason why people can't become adapted because they are too stressed out. Lack of sleep, worrying all the time, lack of exercise, too many stimulants, etc. will cause too much stress, which will not cause you to get into ketosis. Okay? There is some steps, there's an entire section in the manual going over ways that you can reduce stress because it is that important. Again, you're not going to get into ketosis if you are too stressed out. And then finally, we have the other nutritional demon, which is salt. Okay? Fat and salt make things taste better, but yet those are the two things we're told to limit in moderation and even avoid. So salt is another thing that's thrown under the bus, and you want to eliminate regular white table salt. Okay? Don't eat it. It is bad. It will cause bad things to happen to your body. You want to eat sea salt, preferably with iodine, or pink Himalayan salt, or they have some other types of fancy salts that have minerals and stuff like that. So we want to get those trace minerals. If you're going to do a salt, get the ones that have the trace minerals. So I use the pink Himalayan sea salt, or pink Himalayan salt, mixed with some sea salt. But either one is fine. And you will be using a lot of salt on the ketogenic diet, because when you are using carbohydrates, or you're eating carbohydrates, the body will tend to hold on to your sodium, or the kidneys will tend to hold on to the sodium, causing you to be more bloated and look more bloated and feel bloated. But when you're on the ketogenic diet, basically the kidneys are excreting the sodium, so you lose that bloat, and you also need to replenish that sodium, because sodium is an electrolyte, and without it you will suffer some huge consequences that we don't want you to go through. All right, moving on. We're going to talk big time about carbohydrates, what to do about it. It's the first macronutrient and the most important to get under control. So we're starting off with grains and carbs, and we're going to say bye to breads, pastas, rice, oats, cereals, starchier vegetables. Occasionally that's okay, but high sugar fruits, muffins, pancakes, baked goods. Right? If you're saying, whoa, get me out of here, all the stuff I mentioned is sugar. Okay, so basically it's sugar. It's converted to sugar into your body. So oatmeal, a donut, cereal, Snickers bar, all is sugar. And that's what you have to understand about carbohydrates. It is sugar. Okay. Now, the BS with simple and complex carbohydrates, really there's a little bit difference, but both are sugar, and both will cause your blood sugar to rise, and both will cause an insulin response, which will cause more fat storage. Okay? Insulin cannot be present when ketones are there, or insulin cannot be present for ketones to be present. So insulin is always there if you eat carbs, because it's trying to lower that blood sugar level, and then you can't burn fat when either your blood sugar is elevated or you have insulin circulating in your body. Okay? With simple carbohydrates, you will tend to eat or want more quicker. That's because your blood sugar will rise quicker and it'll fall quicker. So you'll start to get those hunger pains again. But the problem is you'll crave more of those simple sugars rather than good, healthy foods. With complex carbohydrates, it tends to keep your blood sugar more stable, but it also keeps it elevated longer. So that's also another issue. They say it gives you more energy, but it also keeps your blood sugar high, keeps the insulin in there, and keeps storing fat, which we don't want. Now, metabolic syndrome. All right, what is it? It's 5 total factors, and if you've got 3 of them, you basically have metabolic syndrome. It's a measure of your risk for the big diseases that you don't want: heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, all that bad stuff that you don't want. Certain types of cancers. It's called pre-diabetic as well, because the majority of people that have 3 out of these 5 will eventually get full-blown diabetes. So I say if you have even one of these, then lifestyle changes need to start happening ASAP. The 5 factors are waist, if it's greater than 40 for a man, greater than 35 for a woman. So 40 or above and 35 or above. Blood pressure, if it's 130/85 or you're on blood pressure meds. Triglycerides, 150 milligrams per deciliter or higher. All right. Triglycerides we'll talk about a lot more because it's a huge risk factor for a lot of things. Number 4, fasting glucose is greater than 100 or more, or you're on medication for that. And finally, HDL is under 40 for a man, 50 for a woman. Okay? Each independent risk factor is going to cause you something, so start making changes if you have one of those. Obviously, you're on this to make some changes, and let's get started. So how grains and carbs are going to start, or how they're going to affect metabolic syndrome. So with your waist, carbs lead directly to belly fat. Okay? It gives you whole body fat, but mostly it's going straight to the belly. The belly fat is the worst fat you can have, and even if your belly doesn't stick out, you could still be TOFI, which is an acronym, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, because really you have no idea how much visceral fat you have, and grains and whole wheat and sugar will cause the most visceral fat to be present in your body. So visceral fat is the fat stuck around your organs. It is highly inflammatory, which we'll talk about later. And yeah, it's the worst fat that you can have. So blood pressure, how that affects metabolic syndrome. The visceral fat, again, constricts the organs. So blood flow from your brain to your heart and back and out to the limbs doesn't flow as well. So blood pressure increases. Carbs also make you hold on to more sodium. Again, that bloating feeling and looking and feeling fatter. That's why they tell you to stay away from salt when you're on a high carbohydrate diet. But when you're on a ketogenic diet, you need to take in more. Triglycerides. When blood sugar is normal, you have fatty acids floating around in your body. So basically, you're burning fat at that time. But then when you eat carbs, your blood sugar goes up. In response, insulin comes out to put the blood sugar back down. Insulin pushes those fatty acids back into the fat cell, turning them into triglycerides and making the fat cell bigger and fatter. Okay? And triglycerides, independent risk factor for basically every single disease you'd never want to get. So it's important to know what your triglycerides are. Fasting glucose. If it's over 100, you need to watch out. Okay? 125 is the current threshold for diabetes. If you're over 100, you're basically pre-diabetic, and your chances to get type 2 diabetes go up 300%. So that's big time. The Cleveland Clinic now uses 90 as their marker. And what's the best way to lower fasting glucose? Lower your carbs, or the ketogenic diet. And then finally, how does HDL affect metabolic syndrome? Too many carbs lowers the good HDL cholesterol, and it also increases the bad LDL. Okay. Much more on cholesterol here pretty soon. It's one of my passion projects. All right, moving on. Gluten. Gluten. So what is gluten? Gluten is a protein found in wheat. It gives it its stretchiness or doughiness. Okay, you find it in wheat, barley, kamut, rye, and some other stuff as well. In my opinion, everybody should be gluten-free for 2 reasons. Number 1, it affects the gut. So I'm sure you've heard of celiac and gluten sensitivity. If you have that, you basically need to be gluten-free and very strict about it. Now there is non-gluten or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. A lot of people in the medical community are calling this bull, but those same people, they have no idea what's going on in the gut and in the small intestine. Plus, all of the products that do contain gluten, they do one thing. They raise your blood sugar. And I think we've learned what blood sugar does. It starts the cascade. Blood sugar, insulin, fat accumulation. All right. Then number two reason everybody should be on a gluten-free diet is neurological damage. All right, it affects everybody through the brain. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. What else crosses the blood-brain barrier? Nicotine, alcohol, cocaine, heroin, caffeine, sugar. Okay, all crosses the blood-brain barrier. Alzheimer's disease is now a top 10 killer, and dementia is the precursor to that. My grandma had dementia, and she would not let me into her house because she did not recognize me. I even showed her my license, and she told me, you need to give that back to Jason. So it's Alzheimer's, brain decline, dementia wreaks havoc on families as well. So it actually costs more to treat Alzheimer's and dementia than it does cancers in this country, in the US. So it is not an old person disease, and it's not a genetic disease. Okay? It is nutritional. All right? They're now calling Alzheimer's disease type 3 diabetes. And once you get it, it's not reversible. So you can alleviate symptoms through low-carb interventions, ketogenic interventions, but you cannot completely reverse Alzheimer's or dementia. All right, moving on, inflammation. So inflammation is bad. It basically opens you up to everything. Okay, it's a little bit is good, but we want it to be acute. So we want it to come and we want it to go. So we want it to come in, fix the problem, and then go out and come another day. Problem is, a lot of people are in a chronic state. Okay? You get inflammation from the foods you eat, the chemicals you put on your body, and the toxins from the environment. Okay, so we're exposed every day if you go outside and you live in the US. Inflammation via the diet, carbs. Okay? If you have a high carbohydrate diet, you have a high inflammation diet, especially if they're processed carbs. Whole wheat bread is processed carbs. It doesn't come in a nice, neat, tidy package all sliced like that. Okay? It has been processed and highly processed. And most of them have been added with artificial sweeteners, high fructose corn syrup, sugar, and other crap that does not need to be in your body. Okay? Belly fat is the huge causer of inflammation. Again, back to visceral fat. Visceral fat is the #1 cause of inflammation inside of the gut. Okay. Gluten, grains, wheat, sugar, again, all cross the blood-brain barrier. This is why it is so addictive. Okay. Nicotine, again, alcohol, cocaine, it's very, very addictive and hard to get off. What do you do if you are hooked on cocaine? You usually send that person to a rehab center. Okay? A lot of people fail there, but there's no rehab center for wheat. There's no rehab center for whole grains. Okay? It's part of our culture. You go to a restaurant, they give you a bread plate. They say, here, eat this bread, and it tastes wonderful. Okay? I know how wonderful bread tastes, and it's like that for a reason. Okay? They make it that way because it sends off, again, it crosses the blood-brain barrier. It sends off neurotransmitters that say, that is so good. I want some more. Give me some more. Okay? And yeah, it just keeps lighting up. So you keep wanting more and more. It's just like a cigarette. Okay? Smoker smokes it, gets the nicotine. Hour later, they say, I need more. Give me more. That's why it's so hard to quit. It's hard to quit all those things I mentioned. Smoking, cocaine, heroin, alcohol, okay, wheat, all very, very hard things give up. Okay, so the pattern will just continue and continue, and if you try to get off any of those things, you will get withdrawal symptoms. Okay, all right, very addictive, and basically, if you are in a state of chronic inflammation, you have little civil wars going on in your body at all times. So your body will send in antioxidants, cholesterol being one, and they fight off inflammation. Okay, the problem is if you eat carbs all day long, you have those civil wars going on at all times. So you can never, ever feel completely healthy. So in person A, inflammation could lead to Alzheimer's. In person B, obesity. Person C, diabetes. Person D, cancer. Person E, migraine headaches. All right, it all just depends on your epigenetics and what gets turned on. What genes get turned on is basically what you're going to get if you have chronic inflammation. Okay, so cholesterol, I'll stop the video here for about a half hour, and then we'll start picking up with cholesterol for part 2.